so point to the sky and press. All right, it works. All right, so first of all, thank you for having me here. It's nice to be surrounded by like-minded people and people who are interested in, addressing the same questions that I'm interested in addressing as well. As Pierre so nicely introduced, I'm Yiwen. I'm assistant professor here at Asian School of the Environment. I'm also jointly appointed with the School of Social Sciences under the Public Policy Department. So in general, I'm interested in doing two things. There are two main things that take up a lot of the time that I used to think, and that's how we deal with biodiversity loss and how we deal with climate change. And it's not just me, right? Everybody here in the world, everybody here in the room is aware of this and knows that it's important to try to address, right? And this, honestly, is how I got into the realm of nature-based climate solutions, because it's a nice intersection between biodiversity loss as well as climate change. When we talk about nature-based climate solutions, normally we talk about three main things, and I'm sure over the course of this few days, you would have heard several different definitions of nature-based climate solutions. This is what I tend to use as my descriptor, right? So basically, they are land management interventions, right? They include protection, restoration, and improved management of these land areas, ecosystems. It can include grasslands, terrestrial forests, wetlands, coastal systems, but as well as many, many more, all right? You would hear things around farming areas as well. And in general, what I think makes nature-based climate solutions really exciting is that, number one, there's a huge demand for it when it comes to, within carbon markets, voluntary or sometimes compliance. An important thing about it is that because it's based around carbon, it's measurable and it's fungible, which means it provides a means to channel money from industry over back to conservation. And a big part of what we know is that conservation is really expensive, right? There is a goal to try to preserve biodiversity, right? But there's a huge funding gap of up to $700 billion a year, right? And the important thing is that since COP15, right, there's this huge push to try to figure out ways to fund this, right? It's the question that's been bugging people for a long time, right? But it's important to try to figure out how to do that. One way to do it is to use payment for ecosystem services, and that's where nature-based climate solutions come in. And as we know from the recent COP16, financing for nature is a big part of, I guess, what leaves me slightly disappointed with the whole thing. So I've tried to answer this for several years already. One of the questions I've been bugged with is how we can try to conserve tropical forests through carbon markets. And one of the research that we produced a while back, the color is quite extreme, apologize. Basically, what we found was that we did this across tropical terrestrial forests as well as mangrove forests. And basically, in tropical forests, only 20% of all areas can be financially viable under several different assumptions, including the fact that we were assuming that it will be $5 per ton of carbon. And for mangrove forests, only about 10% of the area would be financially viable. So this represents huge limits to how much we can actually rely on carbon markets to conserve nature. But there are also many other limits. For example, we know that it's important to maintain these areas. There's also existing land uses that could compete with carbon markets. And there's also a need to monitor and make sure that all these projects are going according to plan. So in another study, what we tried to do was to start with Southeast Asia, try to figure out where we can restore, right? For which degraded lands we can restore. And what we find is we apply several of these barriers and constraints to conservation, to the restoration of habitats. What we find is that there's a huge amount that actually is not viable anymore. So only roughly 2% would be achievable if we consider all of these limitations at the same time. Of course, that's not necessarily the case. There are many on-the-ground conditions that limit what is doable. But this is just to show that there is a huge limiting potential of a lot of these considerations that people actually have to care about. And there are, of course, many other limiting factors as well, right? I'm sure a lot of people in the room will be familiar with this, but there's huge questions on additionality, what we should consider additional, and how then that applies to conserving nature. There's issues around leakage and permanence, right, which affects how long the project should be viable, and does that actually match up with what we need for conservation of biodiversity? And of course, there are misalignment of desired outcomes, right? There are some cases where you might have a decent amount of biodiversity, but maybe not a lot of carbon. But what I don't want to end this on a sort of negative note. There is still potential, and it's important to remember that. So what I want to point to in this really bright figure is that if you focus in on Southeast Asia, right, we find that the greatest potential, even though a lot of the areas are not that financially viable, there's a lot of issues, Southeast Asia represents a very unique place, right? We have high carbon stocks, we have high levels of biodiversity, high levels of deforestation and habitat loss at the same time. So that means that these areas actually have the greatest potential in terms of generating carbon credits. And I think it's a very good reason to try to focus within our region. At the same time, I would just remind people that nature-based climate solution isn't just carbon markets. There are many other forms of nature-based climate solutions. Even things such as protected areas are very important for both climate and biodiversity, as well as many other ecosystem services that we were talking about earlier. There's also other ways of trying to conserve biodiversity and provide climate change benefits at the same time, right? One of the papers that we worked on previously was focusing on tiger conservation, and found that in areas that were designated as tiger reserves, these areas actually managed to preserve the environment well enough to have climate benefits at the same time. So just to summarize all of this is that there are many overlaps between biodiversity conservation and climate change mitigation. Nature-based climate solutions holds huge potential, but there are many limits. So it's also in the general sense that even though there's a lot of promise, we need to be really cognizant of what the limitations are. And we need to figure out new ways to enhance synergies. Right, and with that, I'd like to thank all of these people, my lab, and all the areas, organizations we've done the research in. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much to Pierre and Mimi for inviting us to be here today. I am going to sort of introduce a little bit more my role in our organization and the kind of work that we do in this space over the course of the next 10 minutes. So I will start with TNC, and I'm doing this, is that right? Okay, great. So I think, just for those of you who may not know the Nature Conservancy, TNC is a global environmental organization with a mission to conserve the lands and waters on which all life depends. We work in more than 70 countries and territories worldwide, and we have about 6,000 staff working across the globe. We are really place a strong emphasis on being a science-based organization and taking a very collaborative and solution-oriented kind of multi-stakeholder approach to achieving pretty ambitious goals for climate, for nature, and for people. And we've been active in carbon markets since 1996, actually, when we helped to create the world's first avoided deforestation project to earn third-party certification for its emissions reductions. So it's pretty good to see kind of a common theme here. I think I'm picking up on something that Yiwen just spoke to a little bit with this graph. As Pierre said, at TNC, I lead a team that works across the Asia-Pacific region and is really focused on advancing high-quality nature-based solutions as a solution to two crises that we're dealing with, to really the twin crises of climate change and biodiversity loss. And so those two outcomes are treated sort of as having equal importance in how we think about this. And we really see these as a pathway to combat species decline and global temperature rise, while also enhancing resilience for people as well. And so again, I'm gonna talk a little bit about, just a slightly different angle, but pretty consistent. That's good to see what we actually mean when we say kind of nature-based solutions for climate. And at TNC, we sort of take our very high-level guidance from a paper that was published that some of our scientists were involved in 2017. Which really identified a number of specific practices for how we can use nature to mitigate climate change. And so, you may have heard nature-based solutions itself refers broadly to the role that nature can play in combating quite a number of societal challenges that we face. But here, I'm really focused on how can nature help us address the problem of climate change, and specifically thinking from a mitigation lens, although a lot of these can have adaptation benefits as well. But given the focus on carbon markets, that's kind of the angle that I'm coming at it from today. And so the study found that nature has the sort of biophysical potential, the ability to mitigate up to 11 gigatons, right, of CO2 or greenhouse gases, which is about a third of what we need to stabilize the climate by 2030. But I really welcome sort of the emphasis on the limitations. This is kind of our starting point of what is biophysically possible, but then there are a whole other, several other factors that we have to consider, right, to get to these numbers, and that's actually quite challenging. And I think, you hinted at some of those. So just not to suggest that this is easy at all, but similarly, we're really talking about three main types of interventions: protection, sustainable management, and restoration. And we're talking broadly about, I've kind of highlighted four systems here: forests, grasslands, wetlands, which includes coastal wetlands as well, and then croplands as well. So, so if you take the example of a mangrove, you can stop mangrove loss, you can prevent conversion that's happening. So that's the protect piece. You could introduce specific management techniques into a mangrove area that's really enhancing, right, the climate impact that you're getting from that mangrove. Or you could look at an area that's been converted, a coastal area that's been converted to croplands, right, and maybe reintroduce tidal flows and allow those mangroves to regenerate. So those are just examples of what we mean, some of the different types of interventions that we're talking about when we say MBS. And I think it's always important just to highlight that we're never talking about the powerful role of nature in mitigating climate change as an alternative to decarbonization or as a substitute for that at all, right? It really needs to be in addition to. I said it's a third of the solution, right? So it really needs to be happening hand in hand with decarbonization. But at the same time, we know that it's not enough to get off fossil fuels. Like, we also have to protect our intact natural systems. And it's not enough to just transition to EVs. We also need to be sustainably managing all of our lands. And it's not enough to kind of decarbonize our industrial processes. We need to be restoring our ecosystems as well. So we just need to be doing it all. But I think it's always really important to acknowledge that it's never a substitute in how we think about it. So we're talking about carbon markets today. And at the Nature Conservancy, we're looking at advancing nature-based solutions for climate through quite a wide range of strategies. And high-quality carbon markets are one of them, right? So not to say that this is the be-all, but it's among everything that we need to be doing like yesterday, right? And carbon markets in particular have some interesting advantages. The first point, like I said, we need to be doing it all. But they have proven to be an efficient and effective vehicle to actually direct financing, particularly towards Indigenous peoples and local communities on the ground, right? And so that's a really important attribute of carbon markets that we need to really focus on and improve and enhance. And also the second point is just that we know that we need private capital, that the public funding alone is not going to get us, to realize that potential that I indicated at the beginning. And so we need these kinds of mechanisms that enable us to direct private capital towards MBS. Maybe I don't need to spend too much time on this, but this is just to say that, our focus is really on quality, right? And so when we talk about, wanting markets to direct investment towards nature-based solutions, we want that to be done. We want that investment to be going towards high-quality projects. And there's quality on the supply side, and there's quality on the demand side as well. And so quality on the supply side can be around the integrity. It is, part of it is around the integrity of your carbon accounting and addressing some of the issues that Yiwen already raised around leakage and permanence and those kinds of things. But it's also about how you partner with Indigenous and local communities on the ground and how you support more locally led kind of ownership, more locally led projects. It's about measuring biodiversity and human well-being outcomes and kind of treating that with the same rigor that you do for your climate impact as well. Gender equity, and where possible even enhanced resilience, because we can see that the impacts of climate change are also becoming a really important risk to the permanence, to the durability and the sustainability of our projects. But then on the demand side, you know, quality is really important too, because like I said before, carbon credits should always be additional to decarbonizing. It shouldn't be used as an alternative. Companies that are using them should have publicly announced science-based net zero targets, and they should be publicly reporting on their progress towards those targets. And offsets should really be used as a temporary limited solution for really difficult to achieve emissions reductions in the near term. So I think it's just important to recognize that we need to think about quality from both sides of the equation. And it's really important because if we don't have quality, we don't have market confidence. We've already seen that decline in recent years due to, you know, highlighting of projects that were of poor quality. Because there are great projects out there and there are really bad projects out there, and that's the challenge. The bad ones get a lot of attention, right? It's important because, like I said, this is a really important financing tool, and we need that. And we need financing for the kind of behavior change that we need to see. And we just won't meet our goals if we're not able to mobilize the carbon markets. I just wanted to give a sense here, just so you know sort of what the role that TNC plays in this space. You know, we're not a for-profit project developer. Like I said, we're an environmental organization. And so this gives us some flexibility to some extent, and there's quite a range of roles that we can play in this space. And so I just wanted to give a sense of that. You know, we work on developing methodologies for different carbon accounting methodologies for nature-based. Okay, my time's up. So I won't spend too much time on this, but just to note, there's quite a range of roles that we've played in supporting these projects. I wanted to just quickly share, and it'll be super quick, some of the challenges that we see that I thought it was worth highlighting potentially for further discussion. And so with nature-based solutions projects in particular, we want to access private capital to develop these projects, but a lot of them are just at such early stages of development and they're unproven and they just can't align with kind of the risk requirements and the kind of return requirements of a lot of private capital. And so we really see this gap where we need philanthropy and grant funding to be coming in for early stage financing and then connecting that to investment later on. There's not enough in funding and overall going into support for equity and leadership of Indigenous peoples and local communities. That really needs to be seen as part of your operating budget with a lot more resources dedicated to that. Overall, the prices, and certainly what you see on the indices, are still quite low, and they're really not incentivizing and inspiring people to choose a carbon project over farming, for example, right? Or to commit to something that's actually pretty difficult to do. And then, yeah, the fact that there are quality gaps out there, and that has reduced confidence in investors. And so these are all challenges that we're facing, and then these are just some of the things that we have been doing to try to address them. And this is where I'll stop. So I really place an emphasis, like I said, on the importance for catalytic philanthropy at the origination and early feasibility stage for these projects, because the projects, they don't have the governance structures in place to really enter into kind of enter into any kind of contractual agreement. And also there's such a high level of uncertainty at that stage about what the project can deliver. So we're playing a role as an NGO, you know, trying to identify that kind of funding and piece it together with private capital at the later stage. We're working on demonstrating projects that really are equitable and designed with the consent and self-determined participation of Indigenous peoples and local communities. We're working on attracting high prices, you know, that we can promote and have higher benchmarks out there for high quality projects, understanding that, you know, a better project is more expensive. And yeah, we're working on demonstrating what these projects can actually deliver to rebuild some of that confidence. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you again for having me. So I would like to introduce myself. My name is Sofyan Kurnianto. It's a tropical peatland scientist working in April. It's kind of like a pulp and paper company with the operating arms in Sumatra and Kalimantan, Indonesia. So today I'll be focusing on the tropical peatlands based on the previous presentations. Is kind of like very important in terms of nature-based climate solutions. So I'll be focusing on the how partnerships and collaborations in advancing tropical peatland science, because it's very key components of the nature-based climate solutions. So again, because of we are working with the tropical peatlands, and advancing tropical peatland ecosystem is very important. So that's why we are working with more than 20 universities and technical NGO globally. In Asia, we work with NUS CNCS for applications of remote sensing technology. And then from the NUS NERI, we work on the biogeochemical cycles on the tropical peatlands. In the America, we work together with University of Alberta to know much better on the hydrological processes on the landscape scale. And but not least, in the Europe, we work with some universities much focusing on the greenhouse gas emissions estimations in these very unique ecosystems. So basically, what we are having today is partnership is very important to advancing the tropical peatland science. Tropical peatlands is very unique. It's a store a huge amount of carbon and store carbon per hectare bigger than any other tropical forest. And this is highlighting the importance and conservations and better peatland management, since any disturbance can release the stocked carbon into the atmospheres. However, the estimations of greenhouse gas emissions in these ecosystems is still having big uncertainties. So that's why one of our collaborations, our work in Kampar Peninsula is how we can estimate the greenhouse gas estimations in this kind of like particular ecosystems. We work at the three different land cover. We work at the three different land cover types, intact peat swamp forest, degraded sites, and the acacia plantations. So this work had been published in Nature in 2023. We find that when we combine the harvested wood at the end of plantations, the overall acacia plantations is emitting 30 ton CO2 equivalent per hectare per year. And this is a lot lower compared to the IPCC default values. And then we also kind of like not only CO2, we also combine the carbon dioxide with the methane and nitrous oxide to get comprehensive greenhouse gas balance on the acacia plantations, and then compared with the same estimations in the degraded sites. In our study, the degraded peatland includes the burnt area, locked over forest, shrublands, and the sites with no proper water management. We see that the degraded sites is kind of like emitting more carbon compared to the acacia plantations. It's highlighting that the better peatland management can reduce the long-term greenhouse gas emissions. We also comparing the emissions in the degraded sites with the intact peat swamp forest. And we see that again, the degraded sites is emit more carbon compared to the intact peat swamp forest, highlighting that the conservations and protections of peat swamp forest from the degradations can provide the avoided emissions. Again, this is kind of like relating with the previous conversations, is the key components of the nature-based climate solutions. With the AD covariance bringing kind of like the GAG estimations at the landscape scale level, we would like to understand what is the process-based understandings, biogeochemical cycles, and the below ground processes. So that's why we work with NUS NERI. Dr. Pierre, we work with him, particularly on the how aquatic systems in terms of the carbon fluxes. This is important because the aquatic systems can be a pathway of the carbon release from these ecosystems, both horizontally from the dissolved carbon and vertically through emissions of carbon dioxide and methane emissions from the surface water. Not only that, we also explore the role of trees in emitting greenhouse gas emissions. This is kind of like the topic that is not well understood, but is very important in this kind of like vegetated ecosystems, because trees can act like pipes, moving the carbon dioxide and methane from soil to the air. But how it works, we still don't know yet. So that's why we work with the University of Birmingham and IPB University to measure the greenhouse gas emissions flowing through the trees stems, acacia plantations or natural forest. The estimations of carbon stocks and flows mostly heavily related on the ground-based measurements. This kind of like give the very good highlights, but lack on the scale. So that's why we work with the NUSC NCS to use the remote sensing and the modeling applications. By using these kind of like tools, we can estimate the carbon stocks and flows over the large area at the landscape scale, moving beyond the individual levels. So that's kind of like methodology can improve the credibility of nature-based climate solutions. To conclude that April as corporate, we cannot work alone to achieve our goals. We need the collaborators, we need the partnerships with the academia and the technical NGO. By having kind of like these collaborations, we can get scientific rigors. We can get improving our research methodology, get the better data, and get the broader perspective. At the meantime, we can get the academia to access to this critical landscape for research sites. So this kind of like bring the mutual benefits to achieve the climate goals. So this is kind of like our part of the research collaborations with the some key insight on the greenhouse gas emissions on the tropical peatlands that give the important role of these ecosystems as the nature-based climate solutions. With this, I would like to honor to announce that April will be host the Asia Flux Conference in 2025. This Asia Flux is kind of like partnerships of the scientists, experts working on the greenhouse gas, not only greenhouse gas, but also water fluxes and energy fluxes from biosphere to the atmosphere. So again, this is kind of like part of the collaborations between universities and scientists. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sofyan. So now is the time to invite all the panelists to join me on stage so that we can start the discussion. There is one chair that's missing, but then there will be seats for the four of you. So thanks again for your presentation. I think it's very interesting, right? We've seen like fundamental science on how to measure greenhouse gas exchange towards all the technical considerations for developing carbon credits. So the first question, I think it's related to definition, sort of a clarification on what we mean by the term nature-based solutions. I see that in some presentations, some use the term nature-based climate solutions. So my question, perhaps for Yiwen first, what's your definition of nature-based solutions, and do you think there are subcategories within this term?
Yep, got it. Thanks. So yeah, I think all of us sort of covered several different definitions around nature-based climate solutions. I personally like to use nature-based climate solutions because it differentiates it out from other nature-based solutions that could include like water management, even health, things like that. Because as Allison mentioned, nature-based solutions is to a whole suite of potential societal challenges. So for me, I tend to focus more on the climate-related ones, and that's sort of why I use those terms. But of course, it refers to this whole suite of different buckets of management, land management interventions, and that intervention itself is the solution that enables the climate benefits as well as the other co-benefits to be achieved. Yeah, so I think that's, for me, the important focal point.
Allison, you want to?
I mean, I probably don't have too much to add to that. I just like the definition that we're referring to in terms of the high level definition for nature-based solutions is a definition created by IUCN, by the International Union for Conservation of Nature. And so that just refers to, you know, I can't remember the exact words, but something along the lines of the role that nature can play as a solution to societal challenges that we face. And so that can, include, like you said, whether that's water-related, water quality challenges, waste management challenges, but it can be climate mitigation, it can be climate adaptation. So what a lot of us do is just to kind of figure out, you know, what is the societal challenge that we want to use nature to address that might lead us to to prioritize certain solutions over others, right? And so here, given the focus on carbon markets, so you need the carbon credit. So you know, our starting point is that you have to have some mitigation outcome from these nature-based solutions that we're discussing today. And then in addition to that, we would like to see those biodiversity outcomes and outcomes for people as well, sustainable development outcomes. But I think, that's the broad definition, the IUCN one, that's good to refer to. And then you can kind of orient yourself around what's the solution that or what's the societal challenge that you're really focused on identifying a solution for. Yeah.
Well, the corporate world isn't too bothered about definitions, you know. They see a bunch of activities, they find a box for it, and if it sounds great, that's ideal. So, you know, I think in our world, nature-based solutions and nature climate solutions are the same thing in that NBS is a bigger box, but everything we do is, you know, in light or with the focus of sequestering emissions, reducing emissions. So, you know, in reality, we're working on nature-based mitigation solution to be more precise. And we're not doing much of adaptation. We're not doing much of other, you know, livelihood improvement or other environmental, you know, benefits improvement as a core focus. So. I may not be the best person but quite pragmatic about this,
No, I think that's the first good news of today. Like, we have people from different backgrounds, and you agree on the same definition. So I think we can just continue the discussion. Stressing your different backgrounds, as we've seen on the presentation. The next question is trying to understand, you know, what are the strengths and weaknesses of sort of the entities you represent in the carbon management, carbon accounting, or carbon markets area. Maybe Dr. Sofyan, if you want to begin.
Because kind of like I'm myself is kind of like have kind of like dual perspective here as the researchers or kind of like scientists working in the corporate kind of like umbrella. So my perspective here is that the strengths of this kind of like corporate can give like the long-term measurements of long-term monitoring of the land-based kind of like monitoring. So we've done that. And then as the corporate, we also have kind of like put the nature-based climate solutions into the real actions in the field. So it's just kind of like the examples. On April, we have the RER, Riau Ecosystems Restorations. The RER covers an area for about 150,000 hectares, is double than the Singapore area. This kind of like project is restoring and conserving and better kind of like peatland management. So this is kind of like the real examples of the how corporate put in the role into making the nature-based solutions as the real actions.
Am I going next? Yeah. Look, we work with, you know, we don't only work with corporates, we work with NGOs, governments, corporates, but I'll take that hat for today. I understand there's enough representation for the other side. But I think I see two things really that corporates bring to the table. First of all is obviously funding. You know, there's a significant amount of funding in the corporate world. And with funding comes influence as well. You know, if a company like Microsoft, for instance, decide they would try out supporting project and activities that sequester carbon, and they publish a report about how they go about things, you know, the rest of the world look, and some of them would, you know, smaller organizations don't necessarily have the same means, try to replicate. So what the larger corporations are doing is really important because of the influence and obviously which is linked to the financial means that they have. But the second thing is also the length and significance of their value chain. And it's notably the case for food and agribusiness. You know, they're some of the largest business in the world. They are also the most, some of the most responsible for deforestation, land degradation, and so I've done some work on the supply chain of Nestle, for instance, who felt like they needed to well, you know, they increasingly felt pressure, societal pressure, or the pressure of the stock exchange in, you know, in London or in New York, and decided to require from all the suppliers to report about their impact and the activities they would put in place to improve their own supply chain and environment. And as a result of that, we've seen a number of smaller players in the commodity trading of cocoa or coffee implementing agroforestry activities on a voluntary basis, although kind of constrained because Nestle is asking them to do something, try on their own, experiment, report to Nestle, and with the intention for Nestle to come up with a framework that it could apply to their entire supply chain over time. But that, we are talking about thousands and thousands of smaller players. You know, Coca-Cola is doing the same thing, and so really the influence of these corporates is extremely important when it comes to nature-based solutions and what they're up to.
So yeah, I'll go next. When I thought about this question, I sort of tried to, you know, I thought about like three big areas, right, of science and practice and I guess investment and influence, right? And so we have a really big science agenda. There continue to be so many questions. I mean, there's lots of interesting work going on, right? But every paper leads to more questions, I think, right? And so there's quite a lot of work that still, as we are implementing, not to say we stop implementing, there's quite a lot of research that continues to need to be done and that we need to also, I think, use to influence policy and investors, right? There's a really important role for science there. So I think that partnerships with academia that can bring that credibility, that have that credibility with really important decision makers, that's a really fundamental role for us to play, and one of the reasons that, you know, I think it's really important to kind of connect the science, you know, to maybe more of a practitioner organization like an NGO like TNC that has experience doing conservation work on the ground, you know, where we are, again, we're a little bit more flexible because we're using philanthropic funding, so we can experiment with things, we can develop new methodologies, we can test new practices, we can learn from that, right? We've been in a lot of these places for a long time, we have strong local relationships, we understand the local context, and we can bring in philanthropic funding and also support and empower local communities and indigenous peoples as well, right? That's another group that we don't have here. So kind of governments and indigenous peoples and local communities are also really, you know, a key partner sort of group that we need to engage in this. And then the companies, yeah, the investment is essential, obviously, and having that high integrity demand. I think some of the things that you mentioned were really interesting to me about what you see, the first kind of lesson where you see feasibility assessments that have not been done properly, right? Projects that have not been thought through, like somebody has to pay for that way before the project starts generating credits, way before you even know if the project is going to generate credits. So you need kind of, you know, some of those investors to understand that and sort of be willing to put some of that upfront funding in, knowing there's a risk, because otherwise we get really stuck in there's potential, you know, but it's not quite meeting the demand. So I just think if we can bring all those elements together in a place, you know, in a landscape or around a project, that's what we need, right, for success. So I think everyone has something really important to contribute. But I would just love to see us organizing ourselves around the same opportunities more. I feel like that it gets quite disjointed and everyone's doing a little bit over here and a little bit over there. So
maybe, Yiwen, just to complement the question for your answer, knowing that you're coming from an academia background, would you say that scientists sometimes they tend to be over optimistic on the potential of nature-based climate solutions and sometimes forget all the conditions and the necessity for project development that, you know, are beyond sometimes knowledge of scientists?
Yeah, so I think that's exactly a point I'm trying to make as well. But before that, just to add on a little bit, because I think a lot of the points were covered there. I think it's, as scientists, we have, as people in academia, we have one additional advantage is that we have the time, effort to publish, because that's our main job a lot of the times, besides teaching, of course. But there is that degree of influence I think is quite interesting, that provides an independence and allows policy and things to happen because of that. And with that comes the potential to critique things and sort of look at the bigger picture as well. So we can zoom out and zoom in according to what is appropriate, what is needed. And the zooming in, that's where I think the role and the sort of working with people on the ground is really, really important, because there's a lot of these things that you're mentioning, like a lot of feasibility issues that we can't see sitting in the offices, far away in NTU, right? We don't really see a lot of the things that happens on the ground, and I think that's a very important component to understanding what is really feasible at a global level. When compared to like a giant statement like, we will be able to deal with a third of emission reductions needed, right? Yeah, that's great, but obviously we're not going to hit that, right? There's so many issues in the way, and then understanding how things on the ground works is a huge part of figuring out what is actually feasible.
Cool. Thanks a lot. So now we've talked about the big picture, and we have a good understanding of what you or the entity you represent is doing. But I'd like to ask some specific examples based on your experience on projects that are working. And I think we've talked of supply, demand, expectation from the funders, and also the needs and probably expectations also from local communities that play a big role and that are part of the landscape that are sometimes concerned. So how do you manage expectations from such different entities when managing a project? Perhaps a question first for Allison and Olivier.
That's a difficult question. It's a good question. I sort of made a little bit of an emphasis, and I guess I've mentioned it a couple times, on how it's really challenging to bring in to bring in kind of return-seeking finance very early, right? When you're just at the beginning of developing a project. And so that creates expectation. It sometimes creates legally binding, commitments, right? And it puts a lot of pressure, right, on kind of the early stages of developing a project. And you do need that time at the beginning, right, to really kind of understand who the partners are. You need to do a proper free, prior, and informed consent process, which is about going out there and understanding, what the expectations are of the indigenous peoples and the local communities who are in the area, who will be impacted by the project, who may be partners in the project, who may lead the project, or maybe not. But you need to have those conversations and get on the same page about, what the project is, what the potential is, right? Is it going to be able to meet the needs of those people, right? At the same time, whoever's financing that has to be comfortable with that, right? Has to be comfortable with the fact that there are these upfront costs, and that's the time that it takes to align around the project, right? And to get on the same page, and maybe hopefully to build some trust along the way as you're working through a comprehensive feasibility assessment process together. So this is where kind of I find myself advocating a lot for, up to you have a really robust feasibility assessment. I don't know, I think it's pretty hard to accept any return-seeking capital up to that point. I think once you have that, then you can start having a conversation, right? But that's the process of aligning expectations and roles and responsibilities around the project. And you need some flexibility to do that, and you need to be open to the possibility that there is not a bankable project opportunity there. So that's kind of, I think, an important factor that allows you the time and the flexibility to get that alignment that you need to have a successful project.
Does it happen all the time very easily?
No, it doesn't happen all the time, but you that's the thing. You need to be able to go into a feasibility assessment. A lot of times it's you say you're going to do a feasibility assessment, and it's a feasibility assessment, so we're trying to figure out if there's a project there. It doesn't mean there's a project there, right? But it's sometimes you have the feeling, at least I do sometimes when we enter into a collaboration, that by doing a feasibility assessment, it's already like a fait accompli that the project is there, but it's not. The whole point of doing the assessment, right, is to figure out if the conditions are in place for a successful project. And so there definitely are assessments where you have to say, no, we don't think we can achieve what we thought here, right? And we need to walk away. And I think you need to be comfortable. That's what I'm saying. You need to have the ability to do that, because otherwise you end up with projects that, are not successful. And there are plenty of those, right?
Olivier, would you like to share your perspective?
A lot's been said here. I think.
Excuse me, just before you start, we're going to open up for the Q&A. So there's the QR code on the top right. You can scan it. You can write down your question, and then in 5 minutes or so we'll start the Q&A sessions.
There are definitely a lot more great ideas than there are, that there is resource or people to really sort of execute and implement them. there are a number of carbon funds that have put in place technical assistance facilities, of which the objective would be to finance those early stage projects and qualify projects. In the carbon markets, it's a bit of a cruel world, and sometimes an entity was not able to even articulate, a detailed concept note about their project. It could be a sign not that they don't have the right intention, but that they don't necessarily have the capacity. If they don't have the capacity to put together 20 pages concept note, with some basic financials and how the product would work, and how, they would go about hiring the right people and implementing the right sort of, monitoring in place, you can provide them with funding. It's unlikely that they will come up with the ability to transform themselves into an organization that is suddenly able to put together 10,000 hectares of mangrove restoration in Sumatra or it's quite interesting. So we've worked with and I won't mention the name, but with an NGO, and they were doing a lot of work on so based on philanthropic donations and mostly sort of fairly small scale terrestrial but also coastal restoration ecosystems, so mangrove, a little bit in Western Africa, a little bit in Southeast Asia, and they changed the strategy, and they try to adopt a strategy where they would get funding to implement a project at a much larger scale. So going from maybe 20 hectares project to 2,000 hectares projects, and so they went to see some corporate buyers who decided, and that they would finance the feasibility study as well as the project. And obviously, they're not doing it on the basis that they will be using those credits to offset their emissions. They're doing it on the basis of almost, as an experimental, exploratory way. But we have seen that, even the, an NGO with the best intentions, with a fairly good setup in organizations, it is going to be extremely challenging to go from 20 hectares of restoration to 2,000 hectares. And a lot of NGOs think that, well, not only NGO really, I think a large number of organizations that, the carbon market, the framework of the carbon market isn't fit for purpose. And it's mostly because actually it's extremely strict in terms of the requirements. So that we're working with these NGOs who are not conducting things like free prior and informed consent. They have their systems of consulting the local people, and it's great, and that's been working so far. But when you're implementing project over such a much larger scale, then you need to have a system in place that is quite different and more robust and requires a lot more resources. So we see a lot of kind of challenges in getting into project development at a scale that is unusual for some of these organizations, just because they may have access to the capital through the carbon market to only not necessarily fail, but really struggle to get the project out of the early stage of the project, because the design changes too often over the first sort of 6 to 12 to 18 months because of all the challenges they're facing in designing a project that is actually fit for the carbon market.
Yeah, thanks. So yeah, you mentioned the challenge of having a project that fit a purpose, but carbon market is at least supposed to fit the purpose of mitigating climate change. One issue, I guess, is that often when we talk about nature-based solutions or nature-based projects, is that we like to connect carbon and biodiversity. We haven't talked too much about biodiversity, except Yiwen that mentioned that it's challenging to tackle the two issues at the same time. So I guess my question is perhaps for the future, like how can we better incorporate biodiversity into carbon credit schemes? Is it even possible? Perhaps Dr. Sofyan, you can start. You showed some very nice promising results on how managed land can minimize greenhouse gas emissions, but does this also apply to biodiversity?
Yes, this is kind of like beyond my expertise to answer these questions, because I'm not really kind of like the biodiversity expert, but I'm trying to answer those questions, because the climate change is not necessarily kind of like away from the biodiversity, because let's say in our restorations project in RER, it's not only for the carbon project itself, but also for the biodiversity and the community. we work with kind of like various universities to assess the biodiversity levels on those kind of like landscapes. But we also working with kind of like technical NGO to see kind of like the impacts on this kind of like carbon project on the local community. I think kind of like that's how to link between the carbon project with the biodiversity and the community.
So we need the answer from an expert, so please, Yiwen, can you complement this?
I've been thinking about this for some time. I think at the end of the day, we don't price biodiversity, right? When it comes to the carbon markets, there are schemes in place, CCB, gold standard, things like that. But I think functionally, at the end of the day, we are not pricing biodiversity as what it should be. Especially because conservation efforts is really expensive, right? I mean, we hear from everybody that setting up a carbon project is difficult, it's expensive, there's a lot of background work that goes into it, and same with biodiversity as well. So trying to tackle both of them at the same time, it's gonna run a lot of cost. And in doing that, selling carbon credits from nature-based projects that sells at like below $5, it's seldom ever gonna cover the amount that we need for conservation. So until we figure out how to price biodiversity well, I think we are always gonna be a bit stuck in trying to use carbon markets to save species.
So how can we price biodiversity?
We need to do more research first, so fund our research.
Like just on this point, you know, so I mean, I think this is kind of also the angle that we're exploring too, right? Is how can you, if you have a high quality credit, right? Can you get a higher price for that? And so part of being high quality would be, you know, a credit that's also from a project that's delivering these credible biodiversity outcomes. And of course, existing carbon accounting standards have their way, right? They have, you know, like the CCB from Vera, for example, there are complementary standards, because part of it's about how do I know I'm having an impact? Like what you often hear about biodiversity is it's hard to measure. It's not, you know, like it's not like carbon, like you started your presentation, a ton's a ton. You can count a ton of carbon. It doesn't really matter where it is, right? It's all having the same impact. So you often hear biodiversity is much more complex to sort of monitor and account for, which is true, but it's not impossible. Conservation organizations have been doing it for a long time. It's just much more, you know, locally specific. And so, like for example, we're involved with a coalition called the Scene Coalition, run out of Singapore here, of 9 NGOs. And part of what we're working on doing is, you know, we look across the market. There's a lot of guidance out there on how to address additionality and leakage and permanence and all of the kind of issues related to carbon accounting. But then you kind of see, oh, and the project delivers positive biodiversity outcomes, or oh, and there are safeguards, you know, for biodiversity. Well, what does that actually mean? Like if you're somebody who wants to go out and invest in a project, like what do you look for to have the confidence that you're going to actually have these good biodiversity outcomes? And so we're trying to develop like a tool to help people unpack that and understand that a little bit. So I think it can be done, but it's an education process.
I guess that's what would be part of a high quality carbon credit.
Exactly.
Carbon project.
Yeah. Exactly.
The co-benefits behind it.
But not co-benefits.
Yeah.
Maybe just
So
triple benefit. Well, we talk about triple benefit:
yeah,
people, nature, and climate. But yeah.
If we don't like co-benefit, I think we should coin a term that brings value to what it is. Yeah. So Olivier, you can answer to this question, but perhaps more specifically, you can look at the screen because we're looking at questions. We have many questions from the audience. Thank you. The most popular is related to biodiversity and climate targets. So more specifically, the question is, how do we balance climate targets when they are not compatible with biodiversity benefits, such as fast-growing trees that could help sequester carbon in short term, but would ultimately displace local species and degrade soil? So I guess that's just an extension of the question I was asking to the other panelists.
You're giving me the toughest one. You know, this is really an excellent question. You know, I don't know, but I'm still going to try to answer. Obviously, I think we should not consider climate change and the biodiversity crisis as two different causes. Really, they're interlinked with each other's, and in many cases, actually, monoculture plantations might not be suitable in that place where they are planted in 20, 30, or 40 years from now. One of the things that we see as well constantly on nature-based solution project, and notably on ecosystem restoration, is the lack of consideration for what the climate and the soil, and the conditions will be like in 20, 30, 40 years from now, when you will supposed to have this stock of carbon for which company would have paid for. And so there may be cases where planning a monoculture to sequester carbon could make sense, but in many instances you wouldn't want to look at resolving climate change purely from a carbon perspective. I think that's what we call the carbon tunnel. And actually the leading certification standard on the carbon market, they are increasingly preventing projects to issue carbon credits if they are monoculture or if they are non-native species, and that's kind of a way to address this maybe lack of a plural consideration sometimes when it comes to trying to mitigate climate change.
Thank you. So another question I think that's interesting, that's connected to it, is the fact that we've discussed a lot about nature-based solutions related to carbon projects for markets, but there's also a need to maintain ecosystems just for the sake of all the different services and functions they provide for a healthy planet. So can we, I'm reformulating the question, but I think that's the idea, right? Can we think of, ecosystem conservation, protection without the carbon market? Tough one.
I mean, we have to. Yeah, we absolutely have to. I mean, I think so. That's I think there was another question about being too narrowly focused. Like here, we're talking about carbon markets as a mechanism, right, to direct investment into nature-based solutions or some of these ecosystems that are in need of investment. But like we've heard from a few people, that's actually a pretty narrow window of opportunity because the requirements of the methodologies, are quite rigid and complex, right? And then there are so many issues around tenure and land use and other things, right, that sort of make areas ineligible, right, for carbon finance. And so it's absolutely just one, piece of the overall puzzle. Like there are so many other things when we think about biodiversity protection, like, for example, just even the amount of investment and subsidies that are still going into activities that are causing, so much of the damage to our ecosystems. Like that's a whole other issue that carbon markets doesn't have much to say about, right? But we really have to stop all of the kind of negative financing that's going into the continued drivers of deforestation. So that's just one example. But just to say that, the areas that are eligible for carbon projects, like we've heard, it's actually pretty narrow. We should get those right, but then there's also a lot more that we need to be doing too.
Yeah, thanks.
Maybe I'll just add on one additional point, in that nature-based climate solutions doesn't have to be through the carbon markets per se. Even implementing regulation and protection of land, through laws, through communities, pulling together to say that we're not going to deforest this area, we're not going to develop agriculture. I mean, some of this is already happening in line with practices that people have been doing for centuries, right? So there is a lot of gray in this as well. There's a lot of other opportunity that actually is already contributing to conservation, already contributing to preventing climate change, but maybe we're not recognizing it enough. So that's, I think, the only thing I'll add to the very good points that were raised.
Thanks. I think it would be nice also to hear from you live, like we don't have to go through the app. If any of you is interested in asking a question in person, I think that will make also the discussion more vibrant. You can think about it, of course. In the meantime, we can look at one popular question that's directly addressed to Prof. Yiwen. Can you please elaborate a bit more on the issue of additionality when calculating carbon credits?
Okay. I think this is a very popular question, partially because of all the recent controversy and issues raised because of a certain paper that was published and was featured in the Guardian article. Basically, there's a lot of questions on what is real additionality, what is real baselining when it comes to carbon credits, how do we really calculate carbon credits for an avoided deforestation project, right? Because technically, the forest is there, we are preventing biodiversity, we are preventing deforestation and therefore avoided emissions, right? So there's a lot of questions on how to actually calculate that. I think in some ways, understanding what additionality is almost trying to figure out shadows on a wall, on a cave. It's almost imaginary number. You can calculate in many ways. For businesses, you basically have to project how much, or carbon projects, you have to project how much carbon emissions might be developed. But when it comes to someone doing science, right, in an office, it's easy to just use remote sensing and trying to figure out, based on what has happened over time, how much emissions has been emitted. So I think there's always there's always a mismatch, and I'm not sure if there's any way to really get around it. But the main point that I have is that all these are distractions if my goal is to conserve species and nature. Because what nature needs is protection of the area, the protection of the habitats itself. If we focus too much on a lot of the issues around what is the baseline, what's additionality, it means that a lot of areas can't be protected through carbon markets, or we get paralysis, right? Because oh, we can't do this, we can't do that in this area. And the one that really loses out is nature, right? Nature that's there that needs a protection at the end of the day. So I think that's sort of my point behind why there is some issues with additionality when it comes to figuring out how to conserve nature using carbon markets.
Yeah, I think additionality is really important in the context of the practice of offsetting. You know, if you're a company and then you decide to buy a carbon credit somehow to balance out the emission that you haven't been able to reduce yourself, then you want to make sure that actually your funding, your action is actually resulting into this emission reduction taking place and happening, because you don't want to finance an activity that would have taken place without your funding, because maybe that's a worthwhile cause and it's great, but if you are using that instrument to somehow justify that you're not reducing your own emissions, you need to make sure this emission reduction would not or is linked to the funding that you are providing. And so additionality is making the link between the funding and the impact. There's a lot. It's a complex concept, but I think it's mostly important in this context, in my opinion.
No, I think that's great. I think we got a very good training on carbon credits and how to identify good projects thanks to you. So that leads me to the next question that's also popular on the app. There is someone that's a venture philanthropist in the room, and he's interested in high quality nature-based solution projects. So can you please help this person find what would be the best project and where to buy it, which platform? So yeah, please share with us where to invest.
I wish there was a really simple question to that. I think ask Allison at the end. I'm sure she's got a lot of great projects in her pocket. It's extremely challenging to bring early stage project to a platform in a standardized way, and I think that's the Climate Impact Exchange, the venture here in Singapore, supported by Temasek and other banks, have tried to, we're thinking about this and how to enable funding to go to primary projects. So you have two main markets: the primary market, which is where you see sponsors supporting and financing product activities, and the secondary market, where there's a sponsor has obtained the carbon credits and reselling them onto the market. So there are a few and small platforms here and there that are kind of nascent, trying to find the right way to present very early stage project when they don't have feasibility studies, when there hasn't been a thorough due diligence done on the project, on the project team, on the project ecosystem, and that's one of the main reasons it is challenging to find a platform. The larger corporates, they are issuing a request for project and proposals. Some larger bank. That's how Netflix has done it as well. That's how Microsoft is doing it. They issuing a call for product. Obviously, they have a name that is large enough that when they do so, they do receive a fair number of projects, and then they have to sort them out, and they call us to help them doing so. But and then there's a number of market intermediaries from increasingly dedicated project developers that are out there, and it's a small market, so but there are brokers, there are what we call retailers investing in projects or attacking projects all the way to advanced concept note and feasibility study and presenting them to corporate buyers or sponsors who want to chip in. So there's nothing too standardized, but there are a range of ways that you can actually identify and find those projects. Come to see me at the end of the
that's what I was going to say. Yeah. All right, so we're almost out of time. So I'll ask one last question that's addressed to all of you. I'd like you to share one success story from your personal experience related to nature-based projects, carbon credits or not, that has generated positive impact, either at a local or global scale. Please just give some hope to us to make to make sure that with all the knowledge, all the experience you have, like we're on the right track, despite the fact that there are still a lot of issues to be addressed in the future. But Dr. Sofyan, do you want to go first?
Okay, I'm going to start first. So if you are talking about the nature-based climate solution, so we are talking about in the previous conversations is kind of like better management, protections, and kind of like restorations. For the better management, we are working on the kind of like the plantations, particularly on the peatland. So we are working on how to having the better management to reduce our impact on the operations in the peatlands. For the protections and the restorations, we are kind of like having the project is kind of like 1 hectare of plantations equals to 1 hectare of the protections. In fact, in the peatlands, not only 1 hectare, but we are protecting and conserving in peatland is larger compared to the plantation itself. So this is kind of like the one of the real examples on how we acting kind of like how we apply the nature-based climate solutions in our daily activities in April.
Yeah, it's good to see companies taking action beyond what there was the initial motivation. Thank you.
Maybe an example of one of the oldest projects on the one of the oldest forestry projects on the carbon markets. It's a small US-based organization that run a program called TEAST for the International Small Group and Tree Planting Initiatives, and they have worked with 250,000 landowners, small older farmers across Kenya, Uganda, and India, and they've helped them plant trees. Nut trees, fruit trees, all kind of trees on their agricultural lands. So that does provide them with, livelihood, but that also, but they also are receiving a fraction of the cost of the sale of the carbon credits to give them the incentive to keep their trees standing. That's their commitment. They are free to do whatever they want trees once they've been planted, and so the product developers is giving them an additional incentive in addition to the fruits and the nuts that are growing on their lands to keep the trees standing for a long time. And that combines agroforestry, soil enrichment, providing a livelihood, benefit sharing, and this is one of the longest standing project out there, and just quite project to follow, and to a lot of good learnings there.
So one of my favorite examples is from Northern Australia. So that's a savanna kind of grassland landscape up there. And this example also really kind of captures the role that I think an organization like TNC can play in really supporting others to really drive project development rather than being kind of the project developer ourselves. And so this is, the reintroduction of an indigenous fire management essentially into the landscape. And so you had a situation where indigenous peoples or traditional owners in Australia were pushed off a lot of the lands up there, right? And their management practices were no longer being implemented. And so you started to see very large scale fires happening very late in the season because those lands weren't being managed with much smaller controlled burns that were redone much earlier in the season, which was the traditional practice on the land. So we we collaborated with the government, with indigenous groups, with scientists to develop a methodology for this type of land management, right, that was then recognized in Australia. Australia has a domestic carbon market that's been running for, I don't know, the last 10 or 15 years. And so getting the methodology written up, actually getting some philanthropy to do a couple of burns and to demonstrate to buyers what the potential is, right? And then also doing capacity development and actually setting up kind of an indigenous carbon industry network, it's called now, which then can be this vehicle to engage other land like rights holders and replicate this use of this method, right, and build capacity to do that. So those kind of three things are the role that we've played, and now we see that that's one of the most popular methodologies that's being used in Australia. It's generating 1.3 million tons of CO2 and carbon credits annually, and these are coming from projects that are covering more than 30 million hectares of land across northern Australia, and about 20 million of those are actually indigenous owned and managed projects. And so that's, I think, a really amazing success story also about how, the key to scale was that the way the project was designed, the methodology was aligned with the top priority for those indigenous communities, which was finding economic opportunities to get back onto their lands. And so thinking from the very beginning about designing a project where, there's strong alignment between the cultural outcomes that you want to see, that's kind of a key to permanence and durability and lasting ownership. And so I think that's a strength to highlight and a real success story that we're proud to have been a part of. Yeah.
I think for me, it's always very easy to get bogged down by a lot of the issues that we see around carbon markets, around how things can fail, or a lot of these things to consider. But I've been quite lucky. I know people who run projects or involved in running projects, and a lot of them start off as trying to protect nature, right? Trying to figure out some sort of habitat protection mechanism. And every time I think that, this carbon markets is too unreliable and things like that, I remember that they needed to make sure that they have funding to run the next year, right? Basically, no matter how much issues get in the way, there is always this need to figure out how we can make carbon markets work to protect nature, because there is this potential source of money that can be used to preserve nature, right? So I guess leaving everybody with that sense of positivity or that sense of urgency or need that we need to still protect nature because there is this huge issue. We need to try to address climate change because it's this huge issue. And we need to make sure that we can figure out a way that makes it work because the need is still there and it's starting to work for projects around the region. So many great examples listed already. I think just to end off with the fact that it's something that we need to figure out for sure. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your contribution this afternoon. This is the end of this panel discussion. I think we've learned a lot. We really appreciate your time and the different background expertise you shared with us. So thanks a lot.